Nick Matthews stared through the quantum glass window of his tiny apartment, watching the three moons of Neovis paint shifting shadows across the alien metropolis. The smallest moon, Cerulean, cast an electric blue glow that made the crystalline spires look like frozen lightning. 6 months on this planet, and he still couldn't get used to the view. His datapad chirped, interrupting his brooding. Another message from Earth would have been nice. Anything to break up the monotony of debugging alien software protocols. Instead, the official seal of the NeoVision Cultural Integration Bureau pulsed on his screen. "What now?" he muttered, thumbing open the notification. Notice of Mandatory Cultural Companion Assignment. Recipient: Nicholas Matthews. Earth ID: EN-2187. Per Section 7.3 of the Immigration Act, you have been assigned a cultural integration companion to facilitate your adaptation to NeoVision society. Report to the Bureau of Cultural Affairs, Tower 9, Level 42, tomorrow at 0900 local time. Nick ran a hand through his dark hair. Mandatory companion? They're giving me a babysitter? He'd managed fine so far, hadn't he? Sure, he'd accidentally insulted that shop owner by breathing through his mouth instead of his nose. And yes, there was that incident with the sacred handling of produce at the market. But still. The next morning, Nick navigated the gravity tubes to Tower 9, dodging streams of Neovisions who flowed through the transportation network with practiced ease. Their bioluminescent skin tones ranged from soft coral to deep purple, making him feel even more conspicuous in his plain human pallor. The Bureau occupied an entire level of the tower, its walls shifting between transparent and opaque in complex patterns. A holographic receptionist materialized as he approached the desk. "Welcome to the Bureau of Cultural Affairs. Please state your designation." Nick Matthews, Earth ID EN-2187. "I'm here about a cultural companion assignment." "Acknowledged. Please proceed to Chamber 17. Your companion is waiting." Chamber 17 turned out to be a small room with walls that mimicked Earth's sky, complete with white clouds and a single sun. Nick wondered if that was supposed to make him feel more comfortable. It didn't. The door whispered open, and Nick's breath caught. A young Neovisian woman stood by the window, her skin the color of sunset clouds. Unlike the more common purple or blue tones he'd seen, hers had an almost rosy quality that seemed to glow from within. But it was her ears that captured his attention. Delicate, slightly pointed structures that emitted a soft phosphorescence that shifted from pink to gold as she turned to face him. "Oh!" She startled, her ears flaring bright gold for a moment, before dimming to a nervous pink. "You must be Nicholas Matthews. I'm Sarah." She gave a slight bow, then seemed to catch herself and extended her hand instead, then withdrew it quickly. "Sorry, I'm still learning Earth greetings." Nick found himself smiling. "Just Nick is fine. And either greeting works for me." "Right. Yes. Of course." Sarah's ears flickered rapidly between colors. "I've been assigned as your cultural integration companion to help you integrate culturally." She winced at her own words. "I'm not sure I need," Nick began. "The market incident was mentioned in your file," Sarah interjected, then immediately covered her mouth with her hand. "I apologize. That was unprofessional." Nick felt his face heat. "That was a misunderstanding. How was I supposed to know you had to sing to the fruit before purchasing it?" A small laugh escaped Sarah, musical and light, before she caught herself. Her ears shifted to a deeper gold. "Well, that's why I'm here, to help prevent such misunderstandings." She moved to a small table where several official-looking documents were laid out. "We should begin with the traditional first meeting ritual." "Ritual?" Nick's experience with Neovisian rituals so far had been less than stellar. "Yes, it's quite important." Sarah's ears pulsed with a new color, something between purple and red. "In our culture, new companions must participate in the consumption of unity." Nick blinked. "The what now?" "The consumption of unity. We must—" She seemed to search for the right words, her ears growing brighter. "We must consume each other." Nick choked on air. "Excuse me?" "It's a deeply meaningful tradition," Sarah continued earnestly, seemingly oblivious to his shock. The ultimate expression of trust between companions. I've always found it quite romantic. I mean, significant. Culturally significant. When you say consume, Nick took a step back. You don't mean literally, right? Like, with utensils and... Sarah's ears flashed through several colors in rapid succession. Utensils? Oh no! Her eyes widened in horror. It's a spiritual consumption, a melding of essences through shared breath and energy. Not, not eating. They stared at each other for a long moment before Nick started laughing. After a second, Sarah joined in, her ears glowing a bright, sunny yellow. I'm so sorry, she gasped between giggles. The translation must have been terrible. No wonder you look terrified. I was imagining having to explain to Earth why their programmer got eaten by his cultural advisor, Nick admitted, wiping tears from his eyes. Is that what humans think of us? That we eat people? Sarah looked both horrified and amused. Well, you have to admit, consumption ritual is pretty ambiguous. I suppose it is. Sarah's ears settled into a warm, golden glow. Perhaps we should start with something simpler, like how to properly greet a fruit vendor? Probably safer, Nick agreed, then added with a grin, though I have to admit, the consumption ritual would have made a more interesting story to tell back home. Sarah's ears flashed that purple-red color again, and she quickly busied herself with the documents. Yes, well, let's focus on the basics first. Though, she glanced up at him through her lashes. There are many interesting rituals you'll learn about eventually. Nick felt his pulse quicken at her tone. Maybe having a cultural companion wouldn't be so bad after all. So, Nick settled into one of the morphing chairs that adjusted to his human physiology. What other terrifying rituals should I be aware of? Sarah's ears flickered playfully. Well, there's the dance of atmospheric alignment. Please tell me that doesn't involve actual atmospheric alignment? I'm terrible at anti-gravity maneuvers. No, but it does require precise coordination with your partner. She demonstrated with a graceful movement of her hands that left trailing sparkles in the air. The energy flow must be perfectly synchronized. Nick watched the sparkles fade. Your species can create light shows at will? Only when we're... Sarah's ears shifted to that intriguing purple-red again. Emotionally engaged. And what emotions cause that particular color? Nick asked, gesturing to her ears. Sarah quickly turned away, shuffling papers. We should focus on your cultural integration schedule. You have quite a few essential protocols to learn. Now I'm even more curious. Curiosity is good, very good, for learning cultural things. Sarah's words tumbled out as she pulled up a holographic calendar. We'll meet 3 times a week, starting with basic social interactions, then moving on to business protocols, and finally, more advanced cultural exchanges. Advanced like the consumption ritual? You're not going to let that go, are you? But she was smiling, her ears casting warm golden patterns on the wall. Never. It's not every day a beautiful alien offers to consume my essence. The holographic calendar scattered into particles as Sarah lost her concentration. We should probably discuss appropriate complement protocols. Was that inappropriate? Nick asked, genuinely concerned he'd crossed a line. No. Yes. Sarah took a deep breath, her ears practically strobing now. Direct personal compliments are usually reserved for the 3rd phase of acquaintanceship, after the ritual of mutual understanding and before the ceremony of intentional proximity. Nick leaned forward. And what phase are we in now? Phase 1. Very firmly phase 1. Sarah stated, though her ears suggested otherwise, which means we should stick to formal cultural instruction. Of course, Nick agreed solemnly. So formally speaking, when can I start learning about what makes your ears change color? Sarah's lips twitched. Phase 4. There's a phase 4? How many phases are there? 7. She glanced at him sideways, though some couples create their own phases. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Nick cleared his throat. And how long does each phase typically last? Traditionally, several months each. Sarah shuffled closer under the pretense of showing him something on her data pad. Her scent reminded him of starflowers and ozone. But I've heard of some progressive couples who accelerate the process. How progressive of them, Nick murmured, very aware of how close she was. Indeed. Sarah's ears were now emitting a soft, pulsing glow that made the room feel more intimate. Though, of course, as your official cultural companion, I should advocate for the traditional timeline. Of course, it would be highly irregular to skip phases. Completely inappropriate, especially given my position. Absolutely scandalous. They were both grinning now, the pretense of formality wearing thin. Sarah opened her mouth to say something else, but a sharp chime interrupted them. She jumped back, her ears instantly shifting to a professional blue. That's the end of our scheduled session, she said, smoothing her iridescent clothing. We'll begin your proper cultural training tomorrow. 9th hour at the Central Gardens. The gardens? Nick raised an eyebrow. Not here? The gardens are... Sarah's ears betrayed her again with a flash of gold. Traditional for first lessons? Traditional like the consumption ritual? You really must stop bringing that up, she laughed, heading for the door. It's very distracting. Is that why your ears keep changing color? Sarah paused at the threshold, looking back at him with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. Phase 4, Mr. Matthews. Phase 4. As the door whispered shut behind her, Nick couldn't help but grin. Cultural integration was turning out to be far more interesting than he'd expected. He made a mental note to look up how one might theoretically accelerate through these phases while maintaining proper protocol. After all, he was here to learn about the culture. And what could be more cultural than finding creative ways to bend traditional rules? The central gardens of Neovis defied Earth's definition of a garden. Crystalline trees pulsed with bioluminescent sap, their branches intertwining to form natural archways that seemed to sing in harmonic frequencies. Nick arrived early, watching floating orbs of water nurture exotic plants that danced in invisible currents. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah's voice came from behind him. Nick turned and momentarily lost his ability to speak. She'd traded her formal bureau attire for what must have been casual Neovision clothing, a flowing ensemble that shifted colors like oil on water, complementing her sunset skin perfectly. Her ears glowed with a soft, welcoming gold. Very, he managed, not looking at the gardens at all. Sarah's ears flickered to that fascinating purple red. The gardens, Mr. Matthews. We're here to discuss the gardens. Of course, the gardens. Very garden-like. She laughed, the sound making the crystal trees resonate. Your observational skills are remarkable. I'm distracted by trying to calculate how many phases we could skip if we really applied ourselves. Cultural integration is not a race, she chided, but her eyes sparkled. Now shall we begin with the proper way to greet a sacred thorn bloom? Does it involve singing? Actually, she led him to a floating platform surrounded by iridescent flowers. It involves dancing. Nick stopped short. You're joking. Not at all. Sarah demonstrated a graceful series of movements. The flowers around her swayed in response, releasing tiny spots of light that swirled around her like fireflies. The thorn blooms are empathically sensitive. They respond to emotional energy expressed through movement. I should warn you, Earth engineers aren't known for their dancing abilities. Sarah extended her hand. Fortunately, you have an excellent teacher. Nick took her hand, trying to ignore the pleasant tingling sensation where their skin met. If I step on your feet, remember this was your idea. Just follow my lead, she said softly, pulling him onto the platform. Feel the resonance of the garden. Let it guide you. She placed his other hand on her waist, and Nick suddenly found it very hard to concentrate on the garden's resonance. The fabric of her dress felt alive under his palm, and her skin seemed to glow brighter at the contact. The basic step is simple, Sarah explained, her voice slightly breathless. Like this. She began to move, and Nick followed, trying not to focus on how perfectly she fit against him. The thorn blooms around them started to pulse with light, responding to their movement. You're thinking too much, Sarah murmured. Just feel. I'm feeling quite a lot right now, Nick admitted. Her ears flashed that remarkable purple red again. The dance, Mr. Matthews. Focus on the dance. You know, you could call me Nick. That would be highly irregular for phase one. We're already dancing in a magical garden. How much more irregular can it get? Sarah's eyes met his, full of mischief. Would you like to find out? Before Nick could respond, she spun them faster, adding complexity to the steps. The thorn blooms erupted in a shower of luminescent spores that swirled around them like stardust. Nick found himself laughing, caught up in the pure joy of the moment. They moved together as if they'd done this 100 times, the garden responding to their shared energy. Sarah's ears were glowing brighter than he'd ever seen, casting patterns across their faces as they spun. Still think you can't dance? She asked, slightly out of breath. I think I just needed the right partner. Their eyes locked, and their movement slowly came to a stop. They stood there, still wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by swirling lights. Nick was acutely aware of how close they were, how her hands felt in his, how her ears were pulsing with that intense purple-red glow. Syra, he said softly, what does that color really mean? She bit her lip, seeming to wage an internal battle. Finally, she whispered, Phase 4. We could make it Phase 2. Her laugh was shaky. You're terrible for my professional reputation. I prefer to think I'm excellent for your cultural exchange experience. Is that what we're calling this? Her eyes danced with amusement. What would you call it? Instead of answering, Sarah slowly pulled away, though her hands lingered in his. I would call it a very successful first dance lesson. Just the first? There are more? Many more, she promised, her ears flickering playfully, each more complex than the last. And do they all involve being this close? Mr. Matthews, she said, trying to sound stern but failing completely, are you attempting to accelerate the phases again? Just conducting thorough cultural research. Syra shook her head, but her ears gave her away. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? I prefer to think of it as being culturally innovative. Is that what they call flirting on Earth? Nick grinned. Would it be inappropriate to say yes? Completely, but she was smiling too. We should probably move on to safer topics, like proper greeting protocols. Do those involve dancing too? Phase 3, she said primly, but her eyes sparkled with promise. I'm starting to think these phases were designed to be frustrating. They were designed to build anticipation. Sarah's voice took on a quality that made Nick's pulse quicken. Something tells me you'll excel at that part. Over the next few weeks, Nick's cultural integration lessons with Sarah became the highlight of his days on Neovis. Today, they sat in a floating cafe overlooking the crystal spires of the city, supposedly discussing proper business etiquette. So, Nick stirred his color-changing beverage, you're telling me that in formal meetings, I have to maintain eye contact for exactly 7 seconds before looking away? 7.3 seconds, Sarah corrected, her ears glowing a warm amber. Any longer is considered intimate, any shorter is dismissive. And how long have you been maintaining eye contact with me right now? Sarah quickly looked down at her datapad, her ears flashing that telltale purple red. That's not relevant to the lesson. I counted 12 seconds. Mr. Matthews, ... Back to Mr. Matthews? After I caught you breaking protocol? Her lips twitched. I was merely demonstrating what not to do. Of course, very professional of you. A sharp buzz from Sarah's communicator interrupted their banter. Her ears instantly shifted to a pale blue as she read the message. Everything okay? Nick asked, noting her sudden tension. Fine, just a reminder from the Bureau. She tried to smile, but her ears betrayed her anxiety. Perhaps we should focus on tomorrow's civic ceremony preparations. The one where I have to recite the ancient greeting to the council? Yes, and it's crucial that you get it exactly right. Her tone turned serious. The pronunciation must be perfect, or it could be seen as deeply disrespectful. Nick reached across the table, briefly touching her hand. Hey, I've been practicing. It'll be fine. Sarah didn't pull away from his touch, but her ears pulsed with worry. The Bureau has been monitoring our progress closely. Is that what that message was about? She hesitated. They feel our sessions have become too informal. Because of the dancing lessons? Because of everything. Sarah finally withdrew her hand. There are strict protocols about cultural companion relationships. Protocols I've been bending. Bending sounds better than breaking, Nick offered with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. This isn't funny, Nick. The use of his first name made his heart skip. If the Bureau decides I'm not maintaining proper professional distance, they'll what? Assign me a different companion? The thought made something cold settle in his stomach. Sarah's ears had dimmed to an almost gray color. They could do worse than that. My family has served in the Cultural Bureau for generations. If I disgrace the position... Nick leaned forward. Look at me. When she did, he held her gaze deliberately. 7.3 seconds, right? Despite herself, Sarah smiled. You're impossible. I prefer culturally innovative. He glanced at his own datapad. Now, about this ceremony tomorrow. Walk me through it one more time. They spent the next hour reviewing the complex protocols, but Nick couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The way Sarah kept checking her communicator, how her ears would flicker anxiously whenever certain officials were mentioned. The next evening arrived with all the subtlety of a quantum storm. The Civic Hall was packed with Neovision dignitaries, their bioluminescent formal wear creating waves of living light throughout the chamber. Nick adjusted his Earth-made suit, feeling distinctly underdressed. Remember, Sarah whispered beside him, her own formal attire making her look like a living sunset. Start with the third tone, then rise to the fifth for the second phrase. And whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the High Counselor until after the third verse. Relax, Nick murmured back. I've got this. The ceremony began with traditional light songs, the assembled Neovisions creating intricate patterns of bioluminescence that danced through the air. Then came the moment Nick had been practicing for. He stepped forward, ready to recite the ancient greeting. That's when he saw them. 3 Bureau officials watching intently from a private box, their attention focused not on him, but on Sarah. One made a note on a datapad, and Sarah's ears flickered with distress. Nick made a split-second decision. Instead of the formal, distant greeting he'd practiced, he launched into a more passionate version, one he'd found in his research that was traditionally used for declaring intentions of cultural unity. The chamber went silent. Sarah's ears blazed with shock. The Bureau officials stood up. Nick continued, putting every ounce of feeling into the ancient words, maintaining direct eye contact with the High Counselor. Protocol be damned. He was going to show them exactly how seriously he took this cultural exchange. He finished with a flourish, adding the traditional light blessing gesture Sarah had taught him. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The High Counselor's skin shifted to a deep, stormy purple, a color Nick had never seen on a Neovision before. The Bureau officials were practically sprinting down from their box, and the assembled crowd had erupted into a cascade of flickering lights and urgent whispers. Nick! Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her ears pulsing with panic. Do you have any idea what you just did? Showed them how committed I am to cultural integration? You just performed the ritual of eternal bonding in front of the entire Civic Council. Nick's stomach dropped. The what? That version of the greeting, it's an ancient declaration of, she swallowed hard, of marriage intentions. Before Nick could process this, the Bureau officials reached them. The leader, a tall Neovision with stern features, addressed Sarah in their native tongue. Her ears went completely dark, something Nick had never seen before. English, please. Nick stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. If you're going to reprimand someone, reprimand me. Oh, we intend to, the official's voice was cold. Cultural companion Sarah, you are relieved of your duties effective immediately. Your family will be notified of your indiscretion. This isn't her fault, Nick protested. I chose that version of the greeting on my own. Did you? The official's gaze cut to Sarah. And how exactly did you learn of this extremely private cultural rite, one that is certainly not included in standard integration materials? Nick opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah touched his arm gently. Don't make it worse, she murmured. The High Counselor approached, the crowd parting before him. His purple complexion had settled into something more contemplative. "Tell me, Earthborn," his voice resonated through the chamber. "Did you understand the significance of the words you spoke?" Nick straightened. "I understood they were meant to declare deep commitment to cultural unity." "And do you feel such commitment?" Nick glanced at Sarah, whose ears were now emitting a faint, hopeful glow. "Yes, more than I can express in any language." The High Counselor was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, his skin shifted to a warm gold. "Perhaps," he addressed the Bureau officials, "we have been too rigid in our protocols." "But High Counselor," the lead official sputtered, "the traditions were made in a time before the stars brought us new friends." The High Counselor's gaze swept the chamber. "Perhaps it is time for some traditions to evolve." Hope flickered through the crowd like a wave of light. Syra's ears began to glow brighter. "However," the High Counselor turned back to Nick, "such evolution must be handled with proper respect. You will need to prove your understanding of our ways before any declarations can be formally recognized." "I'm willing to learn," Nick said firmly, "whatever it takes." "Even if it means starting over?" the High Counselor asked. "From Phase 1? Nick heard Sarah's small intake of breath beside him. He smiled. "As long as I have the right teacher." The Bureau officials looked like they wanted to object, but the High Counselor raised a hand. "Cultural companion Syra, you will continue your duties, but under direct supervision. And you," he addressed Nick, "will attend formal cultural education sessions in addition to your regular lessons." "Thank you, High Counselor." Sarah bowed deeply. As the crowd began to disperse and the officials retreated, Nick turned to Sarah. "I'm sorry if I made things difficult for you." Her ears were cycling through colors so quickly he could barely track them. "Did you really research ancient bonding rituals?" "I might have done some extra reading, for cultural purposes." "And you chose that particular greeting, knowing it would cause a scandal?" "I chose it because I wanted them to see that this isn't just a job to you, or just lessons to me." Nick stepped closer. "Although I didn't know I was actually proposing marriage." Sarah's ears settled into that beautiful purple red. "Well, technically, you'd need to complete the other 6 parts of the ritual before it would be considered a proper proposal." "Only 6? Nick grinned. "Do they all have to be performed in front of the entire government?" "Stop," she laughed, but didn't move away when he took her hand. "We're supposed to be starting over at Phase 1, remember?" "About that." Nick glanced around before pulling her into a quiet alcove. "Does Phase 1 prohibit this?" Before she could ask what this was, he kissed her. For a moment, Sarah froze, then melted into him, her ears blazing so bright they lit up the entire alcove. When they finally parted, she looked dazed. "That's definitely not Phase 1 protocol." "What phase is kissing?" "There isn't one," she admitted. "We don't usually—" "So I've finally found a cultural practice humans do better?" Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Further research may be required before making that determination." "I'm always happy to contribute to cultural understanding." "Nick," she pressed a hand to his chest, suddenly serious. "What you did tonight, no one has ever accidentally proposed to you in front of the planetary government? Stood up for me like that." Her ears pulsed softly. "Risked everything just to protect me." Nick caught her hand, pressing it closer to his heart. "Get used to it. Apparently, I'm very serious about cultural integration." "So," Nick said the next morning as they sat in a private study room at the Bureau, supposedly reviewing proper cultural protocols, "what other marriage rituals did I accidentally sign up for?" Syra's ears flickered between gold and that enticing purple red. "We should be focusing on your formal education requirements." "This is educational. I need to know what other diplomatic incidents I might cause." "You're impossible." But she was smiling as she pulled up a holographic display. "Look, these are the actual greetings you were supposed to learn." Nick leaned closer than strictly necessary to look at the display. "Fascinating. But you're avoiding my question about the rituals." Syra's ears betrayed her fluster. "There's the dance of eternal stars, the sharing of souls, the threading of light." "Is that the one where your ears do that beautiful purple-red thing they're doing right now?" "My ears are not—" She caught her reflection in the window and stopped mid-sentence. You're distracting me on purpose. Guilty, Nick grinned, but you still haven't told me what that color means. It means you should pay attention to your lessons before the Bureau assigns you a different companion. They wouldn't dare. I'd just propose to the new one too. Sarah tried to look stern but failed completely. You are taking this entirely too lightly. On the contrary, Nick moved his chair closer. I take you very seriously. Her ears pulsed brightly. Nick, 7.3 seconds of eye contact, he reminded her softly. That's the rule, right? They held each other's gaze, both knowing they were well past the proper time limit. Sarah broke first, looking down at her datapad with a shaky laugh. The Bureau has cameras in here, you know. Let them watch. I'm just being culturally thorough. Is that what you call this? What would you call it? Sarah met his eyes again, her expression softening. Dangerous. Worth it, though? Instead of answering, she pulled up another holographic display. We should review the proper hand positions for tomorrow's apology ceremony. Ah yes, my formal apology to the council for the proposal incident. Nick smirked. Should I accidentally include another proposal in this one too? Don't you dare, but her ears were glowing with amusement. This is serious. You need to show proper contrition. I'm not sorry though. Nick. I'm not, and I don't think you are either. Sarah's ears dimmed slightly. What happened? What's happening? It's not simple. Because of your family? The Bureau? Because of everything, she sighed. Our cultures are so different. What you see as romantic gestures could be serious taboos. What I feel could be completely misaligned with what you mean. Then teach me. Nick took her hand, noting how her ears immediately brightened. That's what you're here for, right? Cultural understanding? This goes far beyond my official duties. Good thing I'm an overachiever. He traced a pattern on her palm, watching her ears flicker rapidly. What does this mean in your culture? Sarah's breath caught. That's the symbol for devotion. Really? No, she admitted with a small laugh. I just didn't want you to stop. Nick grinned. Now who's being culturally inappropriate? Still you. But she hadn't pulled her hand away. We really should focus on the ceremony. One more question first. If it's about my ears again. No, this is serious. Nick leaned forward. These phases you keep mentioning, are they actually mandatory or more like guidelines? Sarah's ears glowed brighter than he'd ever seen. Why do you ask? Because I'm starting to think some rules are meant to be redefined. He brushed a thumb across her knuckles. Especially when they stand in the way of something real. The way she looked at him then, with her ears pulsing that beautiful purple red, made every cultural mishap worth it. The Bureau would not approve, she whispered. The Bureau doesn't get to decide how I feel about you. 3 days after his declaration in the Bureau study room, Nick stood in his apartment, surrounded by holographic displays of Neovision cultural texts and Earth romance traditions. He'd spent every free moment studying, planning, and making arrangements that had required calling in favors from both human and Neovision contacts. You want to do what? His friend Marcus's hologram asked incredulously. Reserve the sacred crystal garden for a private ceremony, Nick repeated, adjusting another display. And I need your help smuggling in some Earth items. The most restricted spiritual site on Neovis? Have you completely lost your mind? Probably, Nick grinned, but I have permission from the High Counselor himself. That was true, though it had taken an elaborate presentation on cultural fusion and 3 separate meetings to get it. The High Counselor, surprisingly, had seemed intrigued by the idea of blending Earth and Neovision traditions. And the Bureau? Marcus asked. They're adjusting to the idea. That was an understatement. The Bureau officials had nearly short-circuited their own bioluminescence when Nick presented his proposal. The next evening, everything was ready. Nick stood in the sacred crystal garden, where massive crystalline formations pulsed with inner light, creating natural harmonies that seemed to sing to the 3 moons above. He'd managed to integrate Earth candles among the crystals, their warm light complementing the natural bioluminescence. A small anti-grav platform held traditional Earth foods alongside Neovision delicacies. He'd even found a way to synthesize chocolate, a substance that had never existed on Neovis before. "This is either going to be brilliant or get me deported," he muttered, adjusting his formal attire. A hybrid design that combined an Earth suit with Neovision light-responsive fabric. The garden entrance shimmed, and Sarah appeared. She wore a traditional Neovision ceremonial dress, but Nick noticed Earth-style jewelry adorning her luminescent ears. His heart nearly stopped. "What is all this?" she breathed, taking in the scene. Her ears cycled through colors so quickly they created their own light show. "This," Nick approached her, taking both her hands in his, "is what happens when an Earth engineer spends too much time studying Neovision courtship rituals." Nick ... Her ears settled into that beautiful purple red. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He led her to the center of the garden, where the crystals formed a natural alcove. "Because I finally figured out what that color means." Sarah's eyes widened. "You did?" "It's the same as what humans call blushing. It means you're affected, moved, maybe even in love." Her ears blazed brighter than ever. "How did you—" "I told you I was studying," he smiled. "Just like you apparently studied Earth customs." He nodded toward her jewelry. "I may have done some research of my own," she admitted softly. "Then you know what this is?" He gestured to the candles, the dinner setting. "An Earth courtship ritual. A romantic dinner." Her voice held a touch of wonder. "But here in the sacred garden, where the Neovision soul-binding ceremony traditionally takes place," Nick finished, "I thought we could create our own tradition. Something that honors both our cultures." Sarah's eyes glistened with moisture, another human trait her species shared. "The Bureau has officially approved this." Nick pulled out a document bearing both Earth and Neovision seals. "Apparently, we're not the only ones who see the value in cultural fusion." "You did all this?" She looked around in amazement. "You learned our ways, integrated them with yours." "Because some things are worth redefining rules for." Nick touched her cheek gently. "And because I love you, in any culture's definition of the word." The crystals around them began to pulse more intensely, responding to their combined emotional energy. Sarah's ears glowed with a light so pure it seemed to merge with the garden's natural illumination. "I have something for you," she said suddenly, pulling out a small crystal pendant. "It's traditionally given during the soul-binding ceremony, but I modified it." She pressed a hidden switch, and the crystal projected a tiny hologram of Earth's night sky. "So you'll always have a piece of home with you." Nick felt his throat tighten. "It's perfect." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I have something for you, too." Inside was a ring, but not a traditional Earth diamond. Instead, it held a tiny shard from each of Neovis's 3 moons, arranged in a constellation pattern. "The 3-moon blessing," Sarah gasped, recognizing the arrangement. "But how did you get—" "Let's just say the High Counselor is more romantic than he lets on." Nick took the ring out. "On Earth, we typically kneel for this part." "Wait," Sarah stopped him with a gentle hand. "On Neovis, we do this first." She stepped closer, placing one hand over his heart and the other on his temple. Nick mirrored her position, remembering his studies, the soul-binding gesture. Around them, the garden's crystals began to sing in perfect harmony. The candles' flames danced in sync with the pulsing lights. Earth and Neovis, wrapped together in one perfect moment. "I love you," Sarah whispered in English, then repeated it in her native tongue, her ears glowing with that beautiful purple red that Nick now understood completely. "Shall we start our own Phase 1? He asked with a smile. "I think we're well past Phase 1, she laughed, pulling him closer. As they kissed, the garden erupted in a display of light and sound that would be talked about for generations. The night when Earth and Neovis truly began to understand each other, one heart at a time. 1 year later. The sacred crystal garden had transformed once again, but this time for a celebration unprecedented in Neovision history. The first officially recognized Earth-Neovision bonding ceremony had drawn dignitaries from both worlds. Even Nick's parents had made the interstellar journey, though his mother was still adjusting to her future daughter-in-law's glowing ears. "I still can't believe my son is marrying an alien princess," Nick's mother whispered to him as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Mom, Sarah's not a princess, Nick chuckled. She's a cultural integration specialist. Whose family has served the High Council for generations, his mother countered. Close enough. Before Nick could respond, the garden's crystals began to pulse with a new frequency. The assembled guests, human and Neovision alike, turned to watch as Sarah entered. She wore a dress that defied classification, part traditional Neovision ceremonial robe, part Earth wedding gown. Tiny crystals woven into the fabric pulsed in sync with her ears, which were glowing that beloved purple red that had started it all. Your ears are giving you away again, Nick whispered when she reached him. Good thing I'm not trying to hide anything anymore, she whispered back. The High Counselor stepped forward, his own bioluminescence creating patterns that spoke of hope and unity. Today, he spoke in both English and Neovision, we witness not just the binding of two souls, but the joining of two worlds. Nick and Sarah had worked for months to create a ceremony that honored both their heritages. They exchanged earth rings and Neovision soul crystals. They spoke vows in both languages, and when they sealed their union with a kiss, a practice that had scandalized some of the older Neovisions but was now gaining popularity among the younger generation, the garden's crystals erupted in a symphony of light and sound. At the reception, Nick watched in amusement as his father attempted to learn Neovision light dancing, while Sarah's mother tried to explain the concept of Earth small talk to bewildered Neovision officials. Look what we started, he murmured to Sarah as they swayed together in a dance that combined Earth steps with Neovision light patterns. Sarah's ears flickered playfully. Just wait until they hear our next announcement. Nick nearly missed a step. What announcement? Sarah's eyes sparkled. Let's just say there might be some interesting cultural integration questions about hybrid babies coming up soon. Nick stopped dancing entirely, staring at her in wonder. Are you? The medical council is fascinated, she grinned. Apparently our genetic compatibility was unexpected. When were you going to tell me? I just did. Her ears glowed brighter than ever. Though maybe we should wait to tell our parents. I think they've had enough cultural shocks for one day. Nick pulled her close, not caring that his mother was probably taking pictures and that the bureau officials were probably having fits about proper public displays of affection. I love you, he said in Neovision, his pronunciation perfect after months of practice. I love you too, she replied in English, then added with a mischievous glint, though I'm not sure you're ready for Neovision parenting customs. Oh, Nick raised an eyebrow. Do I need to start studying again? Well, Sarah's ears flickered with amusement. There are 7 phases of child rearing. Of course there are, Nick laughed. Let me guess, all strictly regulated by the Bureau. Actually, she leaned closer, her ears pulsing with that special color that would always make his heart race. I thought we might write our own rules this time. Around them, the garden's crystals hummed with possibility, earth candles danced with Neovision light, and two cultures continued their beautiful, complicated, wonderful integration, one family at a time. Our child is going to have quite the heritage to live up to, Nick mused. Our children, Sarah corrected with a smile. The medical council detected 2 distinct heartbeats. Nick's expression was priceless enough that Sarah wished she had an Earth camera to capture it. 2? Apparently, hybrid genetics are full of surprises. Her ears flickered with joy and nervousness. Are you ready for that adventure? Nick kissed her, causing several older Neovisions to gasp and several younger ones to take notes. With you? Always. And as the 3 moons of Neovis rose over the garden, casting their light on the celebration below, a new chapter in the story of Earth and Neovis began, one that would change both worlds forever, all because a cultural integration specialist's ears couldn't hide her feelings for an Earth engineer who didn't believe in following the rules. 5 years later, the crystal spires of Neovis sparkled in the morning light as Nick chased 2 giggling children through their home's indoor garden. Luna and Sol, their 5-year-old twins, were a perfect blend of both worlds, human features with softly glowing ears that shifted colors with their emotions. Daddy can't catch us, Luna called out in perfect Neovisian, her ears glowing bright yellow with excitement. He's too slow. Sewell agreed in English, darting behind a crystal formation. Oh, really? Nick grinned, activating the anti-grav boots Sarah had given him for his last birthday. He floated up and over the crystal, scooping up both children as they shrieked with delight. That's cheating, Luna protested, her ears flickering orange with indignation. Cultural innovation, Nick corrected, using his favorite phrase. Just like your mother taught me. Speaking of innovation, Sarah's voice came from the doorway, her ears glowing with that familiar purple red that still made Nick's heart skip. We're going to be late for the Academy opening. The new Cultural Integration Academy was their shared dream, a school designed to bridge the gap between Earth and Neovision cultures. Today was its grand opening, with students from both worlds attending. Children! Sarah clapped her hands. Time to get ready for the ceremony. Can we wear our special clothes? Sewell asked eagerly. The ones that light up like mommy's ears? Luna added. Nick and Sarah exchanged proud smiles. Their children's hybrid clothing, designed to respond to both human emotional cues and Neovision bioluminescence, had become the latest fashion trend among young people of both species. At the ceremony, Nick stood with his family as the High Counselor, now a close friend and frequent dinner guest, addressed the gathered crowd. 5 years ago, we witnessed the beginning of true cultural integration. The counselor gestured to Nick and Sarah. Today, we see its fruits. This academy will ensure that future generations grow up understanding and celebrating our differences, not just tolerating them. Luna tugged at Nick's sleeve. Daddy, tell the story again, about how you and Mommy met. Again? Nick laughed. You've heard it 100 times. Please. Both twins' ears glowed with eager anticipation. Well, Nick began, pulling them close as Sarah leaned against him, her ears softly pulsing. It all started when your father got a very official letter about needing a cultural companion. And then Daddy broke all the rules, Sewell interrupted excitedly. He sure did, Sarah laughed. But sometimes the best things happen when we're brave enough to rewrite the old rules. After the ceremony, their family walked through the sacred Crystal Garden, now a public space for cultural celebrations. The twins ran ahead, their glowing ears creating trails of light in the evening air. Do you ever regret it? Nick asked Sarah softly. Breaking protocol for me? Sarah's ears glowed that beautiful purple red as she took his hand. Only every wonderful moment of every amazing day. Even when the Bureau still sends us weekly reminders about proper cultural integration procedures? Especially then, she grinned. Though they've gotten better since we proved hybrid families could work. Did you see the new cultural guidelines they published? The ones that basically legitimized everything we did wrong? Exactly. They're calling it the Matthews Protocol now. Nick laughed. If only they knew about our plans for the Academy's exchange program. You mean letting the students create their own cultural integration phases? Sarah's ears flickered mischievously. I think they'll survive. They survived us, after all. They watched as their children demonstrated to a group of young Neovisions how to play hopscotch while simultaneously performing traditional light dances. Somehow it worked perfectly. We did good, Nick murmured, pulling Sarah close. We did different, she corrected, and that made all the difference. As the 3 moons rose over Neovis, casting their light on the family below, Nick thought about how far they'd come from that first awkward meeting. They hadn't just crossed cultural barriers, they dissolved them, creating something entirely new and beautiful in the process. Ready for another adventure? Sarah asked suddenly, her ears glowing with that special intensity he'd learned to recognize. Always, Nick replied automatically, then paused. Wait, are you? Sarah nodded, her ears practically blazing now. The medical council is very excited about studying a second-generation hybrid pregnancy. Nick kissed her, no longer caring about proper public displays of affection. After all, they'd written those rules too. How many this time? He asked against her lips. Just one, she laughed. But the scans show she'll have your eyes and my ears. Perfect, Nick whispered, holding his family close as the crystal garden sang around them. Absolutely perfect. And so their story became legend on both worlds. The tale of how love transcended cultural boundaries, rewrote ancient protocols, and changed 2 civilizations forever. But for Nick and Sarah, It was simply their life, beautiful, complicated, and filled with the kind of joy that glows as brightly as neo-visioneers in love. Dear listeners, you've just heard a story that transcends the boundaries of a simple romantic narrative. This is a tale about how love can overcome not only interstellar distances, but deeply rooted cultural barriers. Nick and Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful moments in life happen precisely when we dare to step outside our comfort zones. In their story, each of us can find something that resonates with our own experience. Perhaps you too have felt like an outsider in a new environment, or maybe you've met someone who made you rethink all your notions of what's right and wrong. This story teaches us that real change begins with personal courage. The courage to be yourself, the courage to love despite the rules, the courage to create new traditions without abandoning the old ones. Nick and Sarah showed us that cultural differences can become not obstacles, but sources of beauty and strength. Their journey from an awkward first meeting to creating an interplanetary family reminds us that the most important changes in the world often begin with a simple human connection. With the moment we decide to see not a stranger in the other, but a kindred spirit. The glowing ears that couldn't hide Sarah's feelings, Nick's determination to rewrite the rules for love, their children who embody the best of both worlds. All these elements remind us that love truly knows no boundaries, whether they be cultural, planetary, or bureaucratic. And now I would like to ask you, dear listeners, would you like to hear more of this story? Would you like to learn about the new adventures of the Matthews family? About how their unique children grow up? About the new cultural discoveries and challenges they have yet to face? Perhaps you'd like to hear about how their story influenced other interplanetary couples? Or about how their Cultural Integration Academy develops? Let me know which aspects of this story touched you the most, and in what direction you'd like to hear its continuation. After all, the best stories are those that find an echo in the listeners' hearts. Would you like to know about their next adventures? Maybe hear about little Luna and Saul's first day at school? Or about how the Bureau handles the next generation of cultural innovations? About the challenges and joys of raising hybrid children in a universe that's still learning to embrace difference? So what do you say? Are you ready for new adventures at the intersection of two worlds? Awaiting your feedback and wishes regarding the story's continuation. Remember, sometimes the most amazing stories are those that remind us that somewhere out there, love is breaking down barriers we never even knew existed. Just like Nick and Sarah's glowing ears and beating hearts showed us, there's always room for more understanding, more love, and more cultural innovations in our vast universe. Would you like to continue this journey with them? Looking forward to your responses and story continuation preferences